Thanks, Laura, for that introduction. It's great to be here in Little Rock. Thanks to Skip for having me. I was last in Little Rock in 2014. I covered Secretary Clinton, and so we were here for the 10th anniversary of the library, and we all had a very good weekend here. We went to Doe's, we had a great dinner. We went to the Flying Fish, and I also remember spending some time at the Capitol Hotel. And by the end of the weekend, the entire traveling press corps decided that Hillary Clinton should base her presidential campaign here in Little Rock. It didn't work out that way, but it's really terrific to be back in Little Rock. I wanted to talk tonight about this midterm election. It's, I think, a really fascinating election we're going to see in a couple weeks. I thought we could start with just some of the basic themes that I've observed at the AP covering the president the last 2 years, and then we could move into some of the races that should be of interest on election night. I think the basic overview of this midterm is that it's essentially a tale of two political maps. The House is a lot different from the Senate this cycle. Democrats need to get 23 net seats to retake the majority. And in our history shows that the first midterm for a president is very difficult. Typically, a president will lose about 24 seats. So we are in that window where it could be a tough night for President Trump as it relates to the House. And Democrats have been very effective in drawing a big map, getting a lot of seats out there that are competitive. And so, it's possible, history shows that President Trump could have trouble in the House. The Senate, ironically, is a much different story. You would think, it's a 51-49 divide right now. Republicans control it very narrowly, and you would think that, this would be a place where Democrats could do well. But, it's just a map that's much more difficult for Democrats this cycle. There are about 24 seats that Democrats are defending, and 10 of the seats are in states that Trump won in 2016. So as a result, a lot of these Senate races have been focused on places like West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is running for re-election, or Montana, where Tester's running, and the president's going to be in Montana tonight in Missoula. North Dakota is another state. Heidi Heitkamp is running for re-election. And then also Indiana and Missouri. So these are places that are generally hard for Democrats to win statewide, and so they're having to defend these seats in places where the president won, and often in 2016 by often large margins. So I thought I would touch on just some big themes that I'm seeing, and then we can look at some of these individual races that might be fun to watch on election night. I think the first big theme of this midterm is President Trump's role. I don't think you can underestimate the degree to which President Trump hangs over these midterms. And what's fascinating about this midterm is that the president oftentimes will try to avoid stepping in the way of some of the Senate and House candidates. You generally hear the term localize. You try to localize these races if you are running for re-election, and just show that you're independent of the president, that you have done certain things for your state or your district. And what's different is that President Trump would love nothing more than to nationalize these elections. He's appeared at roughly 70 political events this year. And I've been to a number of his rallies, and there's great passion for him among his supporters. But the question is the message, and how is that going to work in this cycle? I mean, I think if you watch tonight in Missoula, he's going to be there for Matt Rosendale, who's running against John Tester, and My guess is the president will say something to the effect of, a vote for Matt Rosendale is a vote for me. And that is not something that we saw from President Obama in 2014 especially. I mean, he really tried to avoid a lot of the states where maybe he wouldn't be as helpful. But President Trump, I think, is really trying to do something that others have struggled, which is essentially transfer his support, the passion that his supporters have for him, to Republican candidates. And that has often been very tricky for presidents. Midterms are a lot different than presidential cycles. So, I think that issue of transferability is something to watch as you watch the returns in a couple weeks. I think the other thing is the message. I noticed during the summer and maybe in the spring that there seemed to be a mixed message that the president was delivering on behalf of Republicans. He would often say, I reject this notion that there's going to be a blue wave. I think there will be a red wave. And he might be right, but I think some of the Republican candidates would say, we need urgency, we need to light a fire under our voters. And so it will be very interesting to see, how that message, resonates. But he's been out. You're going to see him pretty much every day down the stretch. He's going to be at multiple rallies a week. He's been really ramping up his TV interviews. He's pretty omnipresent, and so it'll be a real test on whether a president, can be out there in a big way in a midterm and get voters to vote not for him this time, but for the people on the ballot. Another big thing, a big theme of this midterm that I think is interesting is, how do you define the midterms? I think typically most midterms are something you can boil down to one event or one issue. And so, you look back at 2002, and it was, after 9/11, and that was a national security, terrorism-focused midterm. And that's really the anomaly when you look at past midterms. President Bush actually picked up seats in the House and the Senate, and since then, it's been very challenging for incumbent presidents in midterms. 2006 was, a heavy focus on the Iraq War. One of the lasting images you might remember is Jim Webb, beating George Allen, holding up the military boots of his son. And that was a really tough night for George W. Bush. And then in 2010, President Obama's first midterms, it was a heavy focus on the Tea Party, Obamacare, and there were huge losses for Democrats. That was when President Obama famously said, Democrats took a shellacking. You probably remember that line. 2014 maybe was a little more of a muddle. There was a focus on immigration. There was a focus on more Obamacare. Republicans increased their majorities. So I think, it's unclear at this point how we really define this 2018 election. You might find people who would say that this is going to be a referendum on President Trump and his policies. There are Democrats who are going to argue that he needs a check. There needs to be a check on him, and instead of a blank check. There's some who will say that this midterm might be about the hearings we just saw with Justice Kavanaugh, and there are others who would say this should be about health care or taxes. So I think, right now, I think Republicans I talk to will say that if it's a muddled message, if it's not real clear, if you aren't able to boil it down to just President Trump, that probably means that they can have a good night on election night. I think Democrats feel like, the smart candidates are weaving together this narrative that, Republicans simultaneously tried to repeal health care while also giving, tax breaks to the wealthy. So I think you'll see that message from Democrats. So how you define it is really important. And then I think the last big theme of this election is this going to be the year of the woman again? There's almost a bookend, perhaps. We saw the first weekend of the Trump administration, and right after the inauguration, there were millions of women marching in D.C. and around the country. And since then, we've had a record number of women running and winning in primaries for governor, for the House, for the Senate. And women tend to vote at a higher rate than men. And I think if you look at midterms in the past, the gender gap is often a leading indicator of how Democrats will do. Some of the polls that we've seen recently show a very wide gap where a very large number of women will shift to the Democrats. And whereas with men, it's maybe more evenly split, perhaps slight edge to men. So the gender gap will be, I think, a huge issue and a huge driver in these midterms. So why don't we look at, just to get the discussion going, why don't we look at some of the dynamics in the House, some of the important races, and then we can look at some of the Senate races. And we are in the House that was built by a former governor, so I think we would be remiss if we didn't also talk about some of the governor's races as well. I think in the House, you could argue there are probably about 70 to 80 seats that are in play, which is an enormous number of seats. I was sitting down with some of the Democratic strategists at the DCCC, that's the campaign arm of the House Democrats, and they were telling me that in 2016 they had about 40 battlefields, 40 districts, and they put money in about 28. And that clearly didn't do the job. The Republicans were able to maintain control. And this time, they have invested in nearly 80 congressional districts. And, so they feel like they've created this big, broad field and that gives them the opportunity to compete in a lot of places to get those 23 seats. They need to flip 23. And so they would argue if we have 70 or 80 seats on the map, we've got a really good chance of winning control of the Congress. And most of these seats that are in play are in the suburbs. Think about places like the suburbs of Minneapolis or Kansas City or Denver or Detroit. I think the Republicans that I've talked to at the NRCC, that's their campaign arm, they feel like they still have a path to maintain control, but narrowly. I think there's a consensus that if 23 is the magic number, maybe they could have a good night and maybe they would lose like say 17 or 18 and still narrowly control it. But it's a tall order for them. So I think on election night, some of the races you might want to watch for as bellwethers. I would say Kentucky 6 is one to look at. That's a race featuring Andy Barr. He represents a district in Lexington, and he won the district in 2016 with 61% of the vote. But this is a seat that's now really in play, very competitive. He's running against a candidate by the name of Amy McGrath, who is a former Marine combat pilot. She had a lot of viral videos early on that brought a lot of attention to her. And Kentucky 6 is one of those seats that typically gets called early in the night. It's one of the first to close, and so when you're watching the returns, if Barr is winning, that might mean maybe the Republicans can have a good night. If McGrath is winning, that could be a sign of trouble for Republicans. Another seat I would point to is Virginia 10. That's a seat close to where I live in D.C. It's in the suburbs, and the Republican incumbent is Barbara Comstock. and she's running against a candidate, a state senator by the name of Jennifer Wexton. And this is a good window into the suburban voters and a lot of college-educated white-collar women who play big roles. And so if as you're watching the returns in that race, if Comstock is holding our own, maybe it won't be a bad night for Republicans. But again, Wexton has been pretty strong, and they think that could be one that could flip. A couple other House races. Minnesota is probably the best state to look at in terms of House control. There are 4 House seats that are in play there. 2 of the Republicans, Jason Lewis and Eric Paulson, are both in really competitive races, and Republicans have told me that if they can do well in Minnesota, they think they have a chance. And then California, if you're up real late on election night, there are 5 districts that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016 that are represented by Republicans. And people like Jeff Denham, Steve Knight, Mimi Walters, Dana Rohrabacher. And then there's an open seat that Ed Royce, the Republican from Orange County, is leaving. So if those seats, if late in the night those seats start shifting to the Democrats, that could be a good sign. So that's the overview for the House. It's Democrats feel pretty good about the House right now, but the picture's a lot different on the Senate side. It's a much more defensive map that Democrats have. There are 35 seats up in total in the Senate, and about 25, 26 are held by Democrats. And so a lot of the focus has been on those red states that I mentioned. I would say in that group of 5, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota is probably the most endangered. Some of the polling, has indicated that she's down outside the margin of error. Joe Manchin is probably in the best shape among Democrats in that group. He's someone who runs as a West Virginia Democrat. He's got a pretty strong brand. He's a former governor. He had a ad that came out today that features Bob Huggins and Jerry West and Nick Saban, who the Alabama coach, Coach Saban and Joe Manchin actually went to high school together. So it helps to have those kinds of friends. And then, I think the 3 other races, that are of high importance are, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, and John Tester, the race we're going to hear about tonight. And I think those 3 could go either way. I mean, they're all highly competitive, and Democrats feel like they're in fairly good shape with those 3, but you don't know. So I think the president's going to focus heavily on flipping those states. 2 races that Democrats have tried to win, have spent a lot of time on, are Nevada and Arizona, and both of those states have been pretty elusive so far. Arizona, you have Kristen Sinema is the Democrat. She's running against Martha McSally. And McSally has been a fairly strong candidate. She's the Republican. She's an Air Force veteran. She's been fairly effective. Sinema had some anti-war issues in her background that McSally has tried to raise. They had a debate this week, and that came up. So that Arizona race could be one of the tightest on the map. I could see that go right down to the wire. And then Nevada's been really interesting. Nevada is the one state with a Republican senator that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. It's Dean Heller. And I think Democrats thought going into this race that they were going to have Dean Heller on the run, and maybe by this time Dean Heller would be thinking about life in the private sector. But he has just been a fairly resilient candidate. He had a lot of issues with President Trump. They didn't see eye to eye on the health care repeal. He eventually voted to repeal Obamacare, and so Democrats tried to claim he was Senator Spineless. But, you know, it still hasn't really broken for Democrats. They have a candidate by the name of Jackie Rosen. She's a congresswoman from the Las Vegas area. She's still relatively new, so there's not a lot of voters in Elko, where the president's going to be, who know her. So you know, that's an important race for Democrats, and one to watch. And then I'd say the three other races that should be on your radar screen or will be fun. Texas is one that has gotten a ton of attention. I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding in the room. Beto O'Rourke is the $38 million man. He raised $38 million in the last 3 months, which is incredible for a Senate race. He's been the subject of a lot of viral videos. You may have seen him skateboarding in the parking lot of a Whataburger. And he's running against Ted Cruz, who, you know, is coming off his presidential campaign. He is probably not the most beloved figure in the Republican Party. But, you know, the thing about Texas is that the numbers don't lie. You know, in 2014, Greg Abbott, the governor, got 1 million more votes over Wendy Davis. Wendy Davis, you know, 4 years ago was sort of the great hope for Democrats. You know, Democrats have not won statewide in Texas since 1994. So, you know, Hillary lost to Trump by about 800,000 votes in 2016. So Beto O'Rourke's challenge is to somehow get that state to turn out in a big way. Texas is often a little apathetic when it comes to turnout and into voting, especially in midterms. So that's a tough hill for Democrats to climb, despite all the attention that Beto has gotten. Tennessee has been really interesting. You know, that's a pretty strong Republican state, and you know, Democrats were very excited when they got Phil Bredesen to run. He's the former governor, and they thought that could be a real opportunity for them. He's running against Marsha Blackburn, who is a congresswoman, and she's tied herself very closely with President Trump. And, you know, that could be a race where the Kavanaugh hearings perhaps have an influence. We saw some of the polling shift towards the congresswoman after the hearings. Bredesen said that if he were in the Senate, he would have voted for Judge Kavanaugh. So there was some, you know, there's not a lot of liberals in Tennessee, but you know, I think there was some disappointment among Democrats there. So, you know, that's tight, but it's probably, you know, one that's going to move towards Blackburn. And then probably the Senate race that I'm most interested in, I used to work in Miami, is Florida. And, you know, Florida is a carnival for political reporters. There are always twists and turns, and you never know what's going to happen in an election in Florida. Florida is like 5 states all rolled up into one. And, you know, there's been a massive news event in Florida. You know, Hurricane Michael plowed through the Panhandle. And so, you know, it's a fairly Republican area, the Panhandle. There are about 200,000 votes. And, you know, in some cases, it's unclear if they'll have, you know, voting precincts up in time. I mean, it's a real concern. So, you know, what's fascinating about that state is that you have, you know, the governor, Rick Scott, running for Senate. He's trying to unseat Bill Nelson. And Scott has fully embraced his role as governor to try to help, you know, that part of the state rebound from the hurricane. And he's suspended his campaign. And, you know, he is just going to focus on hurricane recovery. Maybe he'll come back the final week. Nelson has been around in trying to show, you know, the work that he's done over the years. He's a veteran. He's one of the more resilient Senate Democrats. But it's just really hard to predict where that Senate race is going to go. It's Florida to begin with, so it's always, you know, narrowly contested, and then you have this hurricane. And then you have a fascinating governor's race in Florida. Andrew Gillum is the mayor of Tallahassee. He could make history becoming the first African-American governor in the state. And he has focused heavily on the hurricane recovery. You know, his city of Tallahassee was heavily affected. And then he's running against Ron DeSantis, who is someone who has just completely tied his campaign to Trump, and probably would not have gotten the nomination were it not for President Trump's endorsement. And so, you know, that's a race that it's gonna be a real test of the bases of both sides. You know, who gets out? I mean, because Gillum and DeSantis are candidates who are really beloved by their base. You know, the question is, what does that small sliver in the middle do? So I think Florida's governor's race is a good way to talk about the governor's races in total. I think for my money and from my perspective, these governor's races really might be the story on election night. There will be a lot of focus on the midterms and the control of Congress. But, you know, governors will have a heavy influence on the next presidential election, and they'll also play massively on redistricting. And so you have the states that President Trump won in the Midwest that were central to his victory, places like Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. All of those states have governor's races, and Democrats feel very confident about a lot of them. You know, you have in Ohio, you have Rich Cordray. He's a former Obama official. He worked for the Consumer Financial Board. He's running against Mike DeWine. You know, that's a very important race, and you know, controlling Ohio would be huge for Democrats. In Michigan, the Democrats feel very good about Gretchen Whitmer, who is the state majority leader. You know, she's running against Bill Schuette, who has had kind of an uneven race, I would say. And then Iowa, you know, we have an incumbent governor to an extent, Kim Reynolds. She's the Republican. She's been, you know, she took over for Terry Branstad when he became President Trump's ambassador to China. And so she's had a tough time. She's running against Fred Hubble, who is a businessman who's run a pretty steady, focused campaign. And then Wisconsin, I think, will be fascinating. You know, Wisconsin was a crucial state for President Trump, and Scott Walker is running for a third term. And you know, he's someone who has always managed to get like 51%. You know, just enough to get through both times. And you know, the question is this environment going to be one that's going to be difficult for him to overcome? So, you know, there are any number of storylines to watch on election night, but I think the dominant question is this bet that President Trump is making to be everywhere and to be the, you know, the figure of these midterms, is that going to pay off for him? Is it going to excite his base of supporters? Or is it going to turn off, you know, some of the suburban voters who are going to be critical in a lot of these House seats? So it'll be a lot of fun, you know, to watch down the stretch. And I'd love to get your thoughts and take your questions.
Thank you very much for being here. Now you can ask him any question you want to about the midterms or Donald Trump. Got a question right here. Here comes the microphone at you, Suzanne.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Sure.
I was just interested generally in your thoughts on being a journalist in this political moment, both here and around the globe, particularly with the headlines coming out about the Washington Post writer.
Sure. It's been a heady experience. I've covered the president since the day after the election. I spent, you know, essentially 3 years covering Hillary Clinton both in her post-State Department period and then her campaign. And then the day after the election, I was assigned to cover the transition and the president. And, you know, I was in the Boy Scouts growing up, and the motto is to be prepared. And it's good advice for covering this White House. You know, it's every day is intense. Every day is different. You know, I wake up at 6 a.m. and there are tweets happening, and I go to bed at 11 and there's a Fox interview. You know that's happening. You know, it's an intense time as a journalist. You know, I think a lot of journalists have been concerned by, you know, the news out of Turkey. It's you know, it's still developing, but what's striking is that we still don't really have the facts. We're 16 days since the incident happened, and we still really don't know what happened. And so, you know, I don't know that there's a connection between some of the rhetoric that we've seen from this president as it relates to the First Amendment and to journalists and the incident that we had in Turkey. But you know, any time you know, one of your own is in a situation like that, you know, our hearts go out to the family, and it, you know, it raises a lot of concern.
Would you speak to the Senate special election in Mississippi? I was looking at 538, and to my surprise, it looks like Mike Espy might have a chance. What do you think?
So I haven't spent a lot of time on that. I mean, Mike Espy, you know, was a former Clinton official, and I think at the time when he got in, there were expectations and hopes that, you know, maybe he's the right fit for a traditionally Republican state. You know, but Mississippi is a, you know, generally a tough place for Democrats. It's not really one that you hear a lot of conversation about in Washington, but, you know, given the nature of it, maybe, you know, if it's tighter, you know, after the election, maybe that will create more interest. But, you know, I think what Democrats have tried to do in places like Mississippi, Tennessee is a good example, is find a candidate who is a good fit for the state. You know, not necessarily a candidate who will, you know, answer certain litmus tests in the party, you know, will be right on every single issue that you know, the majority of people in the party care about. But essentially try to find Joe Manchins in some of these states. I mean, Joe Manchin is not going to, you know, play in plenty of Democratic primaries, but you know, the criticism that I heard of like a Joe Manchin on his vote on Kavanaugh, you know, you would have to also note that he was a no vote on repealing Obamacare, and he was a no vote on the tax return. So I think in states like Mississippi or in Tennessee, in some of these red states, they've tried to find candidates who fit the state and give them at least a shot of winning, because the Senate is so narrowly controlled. Every single vote counts.
Back here.
Mr. Thomas, thank you for coming out. My name is Josh Snyder. I'm a Clinton School alum, class 12. I just wanted to know, once the midterms are over, what do you recommend that we watch next? And do you think the outcome of the midterms will have any impact on what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I guess I would say after the midterms, buckle your seatbelts. You know, there's a lot of talk in Washington already about a potential shutdown. Would be a partial shutdown. You know, they have the Homeland Security budget is appropriated through December 7th. And so the expectation is that in this lame duck period we go into, there will be a big fight for more border security funding for the president's wall. And what's going to be difficult about it is that Democrats will not have any interest in providing any votes for that kind of funding. And I think, you know, Republicans have already telegraphed that they are expecting a fight. You know, Paul Ryan said, I expect a big fight on this. You know, he's someone who typically is more trying to avoid shutdowns. And I think for the president, you know, border security is good politics. I mean, if you've been following his Twitter feed of late, he's been tweeting a lot about the wall and border security and the caravan. And so if you have, maybe bad election results as far as he's concerned, he probably will be more inclined to get into a fight on border. So I think, people should probably be prepared for a potential partial government shutdown, if not by the end of the year, maybe into next year. The other thing I would say is you're going to have leadership elections. I mean, that's going to be a really interesting test after the midterms. And Nancy Pelosi certainly hopes to become the speaker again. But it's very interesting because a lot of the Democrats who are running are saying, I won't vote for Pelosi as speaker if I get elected. And so what the margins look like will have a big impact on whether Pelosi, if they win, whether she could become speaker. So if it's, if the Democrats come out of these midterms with, say, 235 seats, you would think that she would have enough support in the caucus to become the speaker again. But if it's much more of a draw, or Democrats maybe have a majority by 3 or 4 seats or something, then you might be looking at a speaker, James Clyburn, or some figure within the party who's not as well known. I mean, you hear Hakeem Jeffries, he's a congressman from New York City who is someone who could maybe fill the void. And then the Republicans, I think, will have a similar fight. Paul Ryan, as you know, is leaving as speaker. And so Kevin McCarthy is going to try to become the leader. If they could somehow hold on to the House, he would try to become the speaker. But it's difficult when you lose control. Oftentimes that leads to a leadership shakeup. And so, I think there'll be a lot of jockeying, not only by McCarthy, but Steve Scalise, who has been in leadership, has a very compelling story after, the shooting at the softball practice. There's a high expectation he could run for leader. And then Jim Jordan, the Ohio congressman, he's someone who I think could also seek leadership. So I think you're probably around the holidays, you're going to have these leadership fights, which are like school elections. And if any of you are in school elections, they can be kind of tough. And then I think, there will be these budget fights that will come in the months ahead.
Yes, ma'am, right here. And the microphone's coming at you.
You mentioned health care, and I've heard and read just almost offhandedly that health care is the issue of this cycle. But at least in our media, I don't see or hear much about that. So you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It may not be the issue of the moment of the day because, the repeal effort of the ACA happened last year. It may not be on the front pages, but I still think it's one of those issues that animates Democrats. I mean, I think it's just fascinating to watch how this issue has evolved. I mean, if you were a Democrat in 2010 or 2014, you were running away from Obamacare for your life. And now it's a badge of honor for Democrats. And it's viewed as an accomplishment that has helped a lot of people. And I was struck the other day. Kathleen Sebelius, who was the HHS secretary for Obama, was actually campaigning out for a House Democrat or a Senate candidate or something the other day. So the idea that Kathleen Sebelius, one of the architects of Obamacare, can now go out and actually campaign. They did not let her on the campaign trail, and back in the day. So I think that's been really interesting. The other thing, why it's an issue, you see a lot of Republicans saying that I'm actually for protecting pre-existing conditions. And a lot of the Democrats I speak to feel that shows that they are very vulnerable on the issue, and so they have to try to argue that they're not for, stripping those pre-existing conditions, which are among the most popular elements of the ACA. So this may not be the front page news right now, but I think it's almost like that burning fire in the base of Democrats, and it's an issue that I think has actually improved in its standing over time.
Yes, got a question, Megan.
My name's Megan. I'm a Clinton School student. Thanks for being here. I'm in Dean Rutherford's Midterm Madness class, and we talk a lot about the minority vote. So Latinx communities, African American communities, millennial communities. Do you believe that they are going to turn out this year? I know NPR just released a stance on that it's about 40 to 50% turnout, it looks like. So do you actually think that those communities will turn out?
It's a big question. So typically a presidential election, it's about 60% turnout. Midterms tend to be about 40% turnout. So midterm turnout is everything. And so, among Latinos, they have been central to the argument Democrats are trying to make in Arizona and Nevada and to a certain extent in Texas. And I don't know that there's still a lot of evidence that there's going to be a massive turnout among Hispanics. I know Democrats are concerned that that may not be the case. And I think going into the cycle, or at least a year or so into the Trump presidency, there was this thinking that because of the president's immigration policies, it might, drive turnout. And I think it's still an open question on whether that's going to be the case. The millennial vote, I think, is really interesting as well. The fascinating thing about the millennials is that in 2020, they will actually be the largest group of eligible voters, surpassing the baby boomers. But for candidates, they just can't count on those millennials to come out. So to the extent to which they do come out, could have huge ramifications, and especially in a state like Florida or Texas or places like that. Tom Steyer, it's interesting. He's a billionaire from California. You might be aware of him. He's focused heavily on environmental causes during his career. He has put about $70 million this cycle into millennial outreach. And so there's a big push among Democrats to try to get these voters to come out, and it's still, I think, a real question mark whether that will be the case.
Any other questions? Yes.
With millennials the largest registered group in 2020, does that mean polling is dead?
Well, you have to try the cell phones. It speaks to the challenge of polling these days. How many phone calls do you get a day from just random companies and it just seems like there's so many of these phone calls we are just almost trained to just say no to. And so how do you poll these people? How do you really get a true assessment? I think it's going to be really hard as the millennials take a bigger chunk of that eligible voting block. But it's also, polling is just in general difficult because you also can't oftentimes tell what the intensity level is going to be like. So, what's the turnout model? Are we going to have a massive turnout? Are we going to have a smaller turnout? And those things can always shift the numbers that you see in polls. So I think if there was a lesson from 2016 is that you have to be highly skeptical when it comes to political polling.
Yes, sir. Adam, back here, and then we'll go.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm also in the midterms class, and my question is, if Senator Manchin wins his reelection and Senator Heitkamp loses hers, do you think it'll have a significant impact on future election cycles where incumbents who are running will vote in states where the other party tends to be preferred?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think, it's this map for Democrats, they have a lot of candidates. They have a lot of incumbents like Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Manchin, those 5 races that I mentioned. In the future midterms, it's not that tough for them. It's going to be, the future midterms are going to be, or Senate cycles, I guess, are going to be much more favorable to Democrats. So it's unclear, how a Manchin or Heitkamp turnout, like will it affect how future candidates in those positions vote? But I think Manchin could be, there are a lot of Democrats who just dislike Joe Manchin. They feel like, when it comes down to the issues that they care about, he's, like a closet Republican or something. But I think Manchin could be a case study of how you, win in states that are tough for your side, and how when push comes to shove on the votes that really matter, you can then, add up those numbers. I mean, Manchin was critical to ACA. I mean, if Joe Manchin wasn't there, if that seat was held by a Republican, you could make an argument that ACA would have been repealed. And so, I think that's just one of those things where there's always like this fight for purity in both parties. And, I think Manchin, he looks fairly resilient there. And so, I think Democrats will try to find other Joe Manchins in the future in those kinds of states.
Katie, we got you back there.
Hi, my name's Katie. I'm also one of Dean Rutherford's students. I have a question about your role as a White House correspondent. So do you feel the president successfully uses the tweeting of outrageous statements in order to distract the press or divert their attention from real issues to something totally unimportant? And if so, how are you able to dig deep and find out what the real issues are and address those?
Right. It's a great question. So I think you might find some people out there who would say, just ignore what he tweets, it's insignificant. But we're covering the President of the United States. And, typically when the President, speaks or says something significant, it's news. And so how do you then, as a journalist, as a news organization, handle all of the incoming, all of the tweets and different things? I think what we always try to do is keep, almost your eye on the prize. Keep focused on what matters to people. And it doesn't mean that you don't report on, something that he says. But I think as journalists, we need to try to do the best of our ability to tell, the story of the Trump White House, the significance, what it means, but then more importantly, how it's affecting people. In the early days, there was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of staff intrigue. We're now at the point, though, where, his policies are affecting people. He's made a lot of significant decisions. And so I think it's our job as journalists to try to follow those stories and to try to figure out, what matters to people, what really, makes the biggest difference to their families, and help them understand how those policies are affecting them. It's certainly hard, though.
Okay.
Given your background also in trade and labor, I'm kind of guessing you're going to say, no, this is not going to really impact the midterms. But regarding what's going on with China, obviously Arkansas exports a tremendous amount of soybeans to China. I heard an interview on NPR where a business owner in California who made strobe lights is saying because of the tariffs, he's actually going to have to offshore, which is sort of ironic, his American company, because he can't afford to manufacture here anymore. Do you think this is going to matter yet? I don't know if the trickle-down effect to the individual consumer is being felt, but are you hearing much about this at all?
So I think I've covered trade a lot. It's been a central issue for the president. I think it will matter maybe on the margins in some, Midwest districts, farm communities perhaps. It's just been a hard issue for House Republicans who are in, Iowa or Minnesota, where, suddenly soybeans are, the costs have been greatly affected, and it's affecting, your constituents. The president probably helped mitigate some of that damage, though, with this sort of revised NAFTA deal. It's something that they had worked on. I don't see the China trade issue breaking through in the midterms as much. I think the China trade issue is more a macroeconomy issue that maybe you're going to start seeing affecting the economy, 6 months from now, a year from now. Because what's really fascinating about the China trade dispute is that, you would think, he might back off, or the Chinese might back off, or there might be just some, attempt to just, settle down the rhetoric. But, he's made no indications that he's going to back down on the tariffs. I think he thinks it's a winning issue for him. And my sense is that the Chinese are looking at these midterms, and they probably figure he has less leverage if the Democrats win back the House. And so I don't see this, this fight, this ramping of tariffs. I don't see that lessening anytime soon. And the question is, at what point does the rubber hit the road? Does it really start affecting people's, wallets and pocketbooks?
So where are you going to be on election night?
I'll be in D.C. I'll be in the AP Bureau, writing about everything I'm seeing. I have to write, my election assignment is called The Takeaways. And so the way that works is you try to write thematically and broadly about some of the big trends. And actually, preparing this was helpful to gather my thoughts, because now I can go through this list that I created and see what really happened. But election night's going to be fun. They're always fun for me, and I think this is just one of those midterms. It's really fascinating, and I'm not really sure how it's going to turn out, which is always fun politically.
Let's thank Ken Thomas for being here.